My name's Sarah Wilson, and I will be discussing how to split a Microsoft Access database in order to upload the data to Microsoft SQL Server. I'm going to be using Windows 10, Microsoft Access version 2016, and Microsoft SQL Server, the Express version 2016, and I'll share my screen. Before I start the tutorial, I'll explain some of the pros and cons of both Access and SQL Server and give some reasons why splitting your Access database into a front end and back end might be preferred. Then I'll share my screen and I'll show you the database we'll be using. I'll show you how to split the database and then how to upload the back end to Microsoft SQL Server. Then I'll discuss future steps you can take with your data. So let's discuss why it may be ideal to store your data in Microsoft SQL Server Express instead of in Microsoft Access. First of all, Microsoft SQL Server Express version can be downloaded for free, whereas most of the time Microsoft Access, which is part of Microsoft Office, can cost around $100 or more. SQL Server Express allows for up to 4 gigabytes of storage space, whereas Access only allows for 2 gigabytes. And while this may not be an issue for some smaller databases, with large databases for the potential for scaling up and adding a lot of data in the future, Microsoft SQL Server would be the preferred way to go. Another major difference between the two applications is their architecture. Microsoft Access is a desktop application where processing takes place on the same machine that's accessing the database. And Microsoft SQL Server is a client-server architecture, meaning processing takes place on the server side, but files can be accessed on the client side, and this can allow for faster processing. Somewhat related to this, the security components of Microsoft SQL Server are much more robust than Microsoft Access, making files more secure. You are able to password protect your Access file, but only one password can be used for the entire file. So if a user knows the password, they have access to the whole thing. Additionally, because it's a desktop application, if a user has access to the file but doesn't know the password, they're still able to move or delete the file, which can be dangerous. For the Microsoft SQL Server, however, you can have several different usernames with different passwords, which can allow for multiple user accounts with different permissions of what they can view and edit inside the database. And one final advantage to Microsoft SQL Server is that it supports higher level SQL programming, such as the creation of triggers and stored procedures, which Access does not. So I'm sharing my screen here. We'll go ahead and open up our Access database. So you can see over on the left, we have a series of tables as well as a series of forms. When the forms are filled out, they're going to populate these tables. So, for example, BBSum form will populate the BBSum table, etc. I'm going to open up this Quad 1 form. We can take a look at it. This is where users input the data. It's super user-friendly. It doesn't involve any coding. And once they do, the data is then stored in this Quad 1 table. So I'll close this out, and we'll begin to split the database. And what do I mean by splitting a database into a front end and back end? What that means is the back end is going to hold all of our tables and the actual data. The front end, we're going to be able to view the tables as linked tables, but we're still going to be able to access all of our forms for data entry. So I'm just going to go up here to this Database Tools tab and click on Access Database. This will open up the Database Splitter wizard, and it's asking us, would you like to split the database now? So go ahead and click Split Database and browse to the location where you want to save the file. And you'll notice that the file name gets added an _BE to the name. This means back end. So go ahead and click Split. Access will work for a second, and then it'll give us this notification, database successfully split. Go ahead and click OK. So we now have the front end of our file open, and we can see that we still have all of our tables with a little icon next to them representing the linked table. We also still have all of our forms. We can open one up, browse through it, enter all of our data, and we also still have access to all of our tables. But again, this is viewing the linked table. So if I close this and open up the new _BE backend file that we generated, you can see that we no longer have the forms, but we do have all of our tables without the arrow icon. So these are our permanent tables. Open it up and it's the same view that you have in the front end, but this is where the data are actually stored. I'll go ahead and close this out. Now we'll open up Microsoft SQL Server Migration Assistant, and I'm going to go ahead and click Add Database and bring in the back end of my Access database. Click Open. Now we can see that it's inside the Migration Assistant. When we expand it, we can see that there are queries and tables. If I try and expand this queries, none show up. That's because, remember, they're all in the front end file and we brought in the back end. If I expand the tables section, however, we do see all of our tables here. I'll click on bbsum. And over here on the right, we see the column name for every column. And we also see the data type that SQL Server Migration Studio recognizes. And we can also see indications where we have primary keys in the data. You can see here under the SQL Server Metadata Explorer panel, we don't have anything linked. So what we need to do now is go back into SQL Server and create a new database that we can use the Migration Assistant tool with. So we'll go ahead into Microsoft SQL Server, and under Databases, we'll right-click and do New Database. And for our database name, we're going to select bbsum SSMA for SQL Server Migration Assistant. Go ahead and click OK. And you can see that our database gets created. Now we'll move back into SQL Server Migration Assistant, and we will link it to our SQL Server. So we'll hit Connect to SQL Server, type in our server name, and the database is bbsum-ssma. We're going to use regular authentication, which is what I have set up for my edition of SQL Server, and click Connect. You can see down below the program's working. And now in our SQL Server Metadata Explorer panel, we've got our SQL Server connection. Now that we have all of the tables that we're planning to migrate selected, we're going to run a diagnostic report before we actually attempt the migration, just to make sure that everything's going to run smoothly. So with the tables selected, we'll go up here and click on Create Report. And it's going to open for us in a new HTML page. And we can see right here that if we were to try and convert these tables, we would get 100% conversion for all of our data, as well as our keys, indexes, columns. And you can see that we had 0 data points not converted, which is good. So we're in good shape. Going to go ahead and close that. So now with all 20 of our tables selected, we're going to click on the Convert, Load, and Migrate button. And you can see the Migration Assistant is beginning to convert, load, and migrate our data. Here under Conversion, we have 0 errors, so that's great. And we can see under Load that this window pops up, and it's just telling us that this local metadata over on the right, those are our access tables, and over here on the left, they're going to be put into our database tables. They're saying not found because those tables don't yet exist. We'll click OK. Going to give it just a minute to load, and just a minute to migrate. Here I fast forwarded and we can see that the migration completed with 0 errors. If we click on the migration report, we see that we have a 100% success rate for all of our tables, so that's wonderful. So we'll go ahead and click close, and over here Now in our SQL Server Metadata Explorer, if we expand the bbsum SSMA database and look at the schemas, we can see that all 20 of the tables populated into SQL Server from Microsoft Access. So now if we go into Microsoft SQL Server and we refresh the tables in our bbsum SSMA database, we can see that those 20 tables did indeed migrate. If I select the top 1,000 rows from our bbsum table and give the program just a second, we see that all of the data has been successfully imported. So if we go and check out our front-end database file, we have a bit of a problem because we see that the tables are still linked, but I know by this icon and hover that they're still linked to our back-end access database that we split earlier. So that's not ideal. We need them linked into Microsoft SQL Server. So I had to do some research on how exactly to get this done. And I figured out that you don't physically split the front end and back end of the data file, and you use the Migration Assistant wizard. So I'll demonstrate how to do that right now. So if you open up Microsoft SQL Server Migration Assistant wizard, we are going to name our file bbsum migration again. I'm going to overwrite our last project, click Next. And this time, when we select our Access database, we actually need to select a database that hasn't been split into a front end and back end. So I renamed the file I had before front end, and here's just a copy of the file I had before I split it. So we're going to select that file. Go ahead and click Next, and I'm just going to pause my screen while this runs. So we go ahead and click Next. We tell the wizard the server name and the database name. We'll go ahead and link the tables again. And click Next. I'll pause my screen while this runs. So we've run the migration and everything's successful. So I will go ahead and close this. We'll jump into SQL Server. We'll refresh our databases. And we see this bbsum migration. We can expand the tables, check out the top 1,000 rows. And indeed, our import was successful and we can view the data. So now if we open up the Access database, remember not split into front end or back end, we see these local tables again, and then we also see our tables here linked to SQL Server. And we still have access to our forms. I'll show you those. And we can now use these to input data, and the data is going to be stored in these tables, which now reside safely in SQL Server. So in conclusion, we learned how to split the Access database into a front end and back end. We learned how to migrate tables from, say, the back end of a database into Microsoft SQL Server using SQL Server Migration Assistant software. However, we also learned that if you do it this way instead of the migration wizard, then you cannot keep those linked tables in your Access database. It's simply a static migration of the tables. So in order to keep them linked, the best way I know right now is to use the migration wizard and make sure you select that linked tables. Make sure you check that box in the migration wizard. One other thing we didn't touch on was data types and making sure that that the data types you're bringing in from your Access file are going to convert correctly into SQL Server. That could be a whole video on itself, and I'm going to list some references here at the end that have good links for that. Other than that, future steps that you can take with your data now that the backend tables are stored in Microsoft SQL Server is doing some really cool things like linking to those tables using a scripting language. So something I plan to do is link our web page so that it can live plot using JavaScript from those tables, probably by IP address. So thanks so much for your attention, and here are the references.